"You won't believe what I got us," I exclaimed as I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter, holding up 2 tickets to the annual Photographers Festival. I was excited, a rare emotion for me these days. Claire, my wife, looked up from her book with an intrigued expression that caught me off guard. "Really?" she said, a slight smile playing on her lips. "That sounds interesting." It was more than interesting. The festival was a big deal, especially for anyone with even a passing interest in photography. World-renowned photographers were slated to give workshops, and the latest in camera technology would be on display. I'd been toying with the idea of getting back into photography as a hobby, something to reignite a spark in my otherwise monotonous routine. Claire, on the other hand, had never shown much interest in photography. Sure, she liked looking at beautiful pictures, but that was about it. So when she suggested we attend together, I was pleasantly surprised. Over the next few days, Claire threw herself into planning for the festival. She researched the speakers, booked us into a nice hotel nearby, and even bought a new outfit. This sudden enthusiasm was unexpected, but I didn't question it. Maybe this was just what we needed, a shared interest to bring us closer together. The day of the festival finally arrived, and we drove out early in the morning to beat the traffic. The venue was bustling with activity, photographers lugging around camera equipment, enthusiasts excitedly discussing the latest trends, and vendors showcasing their latest gadgets. The air was electric with creativity. Claire looked radiant that day, her usual reserved demeanor replaced by an almost infectious excitement. As we wandered through the stalls and exhibits, I found myself smiling more often than I had in a long time. It was nice being here with her, feeling like a team again. But as the day progressed, something shifted. Claire's excitement seemed to focus on one particular area of the festival, one that I hadn't expected. As we wandered through the festival, I noticed that Claire seemed particularly drawn to the portrait photography exhibits. She was enthralled by the large black and white prints, each capturing the essence of the subjects in a way that was both intimate and revealing. I watched her as she studied each photograph, her eyes lingering on the details. "This is incredible," she whispered, almost to herself. "The way they capture emotion, it's like you can see into their souls." I nodded in agreement, though I was more interested in the technical aspects, lighting, composition, the use of shadows. But Claire's fascination went deeper. She started asking the photographers questions, engaging in conversations that I found surprisingly in-depth for someone who had never shown much interest in the art form before. It was during one of these conversations that we met Ryan. He was a photographer, well known in certain circles, with a reputation for capturing raw, unfiltered emotions in his work. Claire seemed to gravitate toward him almost immediately. They began talking about his techniques, his inspirations, and before I knew it, they were deep in conversation, laughing like old friends. I tried to join in, but the conversation quickly turned too technical for me to keep up. Claire was asking questions that I didn't even understand, and Ryan seemed more than happy to explain everything in detail. I stood there awkwardly, feeling like a third wheel in a conversation I had started. Eventually, I excused myself to explore some of the other exhibits, figuring I'd meet up with Claire later. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Claire had never been this interested in photography before. But maybe it was just the atmosphere of the festival, the creativity in the air. I tried to brush off my unease, but it lingered at the back of my mind. As the day wore on, I noticed Claire and Ryan together more and more. They attended the same workshops, critiqued photos side by side, and even grabbed lunch together while I was off looking at a landscape photography exhibit. I told myself it was nothing, that Claire was just excited to learn something new. But the more I saw them together, the harder it became to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. By the second day of the festival, Claire and Ryan were practically inseparable. They spent the morning attending a workshop on natural light photography, leaving me to wander the festival alone. I tried to focus on the exhibits, but my mind kept drifting back to Claire. Every time I caught sight of them together, my stomach twisted with an emotion I hadn't felt in years: jealousy. It wasn't just that they were spending time together, it was the way they interacted, the way Claire laughed at his jokes, the way she seemed to hang on his every word. She was more animated, more alive than I had seen her in a long time. And it was all because of him. I tried to ignore it, to remind myself that Claire was just excited about photography. But the more I watched them, the harder it became to convince myself that there wasn't something more going on. Ryan was charming, confident, and clearly attracted to Claire. And well, she was soaking up the attention. I tried to confront her about it later that day, but the words got stuck in my throat. What was I supposed to say? That I was jealous? That I didn't like the way she was spending so much time with Ryan? It all sounded ridiculous in my head, like I was being paranoid. So I kept quiet, swallowing my jealousy and telling myself that I was overreacting. But as the festival continued, so did their connection. They started meeting up outside of the official events, going on impromptu photo shoots together, and even grabbing coffee during breaks. Each time I saw them together, that uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger. By the end of the third day, I was exhausted, physically, from walking around the festival grounds, but also emotionally, from watching Claire and Ryan grow closer. I couldn't help but wonder what was happening between them. Was it just a professional connection, or was there something more? That night, as we lay in bed, I turned to Claire, ready to ask her about Ryan, but before I could say anything, she turned to me with a smile. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe I should take up photography seriously," she said, her eyes shining with excitement. "Ryan said he could teach me, and I think it would be a great creative outlet." I stared at her, my heart sinking. This was more than just a passing interest. Claire was serious about this, serious enough to continue seeing Ryan after the festival was over. I forced a smile and nodded, trying to hide the turmoil brewing inside me. "That sounds great," I said, my voice betraying none of the anxiety I felt. But as I turned away from her, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives were about to change in ways I wasn't prepared for. The fourth day of the festival started like the others. Claire was up early, eager to get back to the events, while I took my time, feeling increasingly like an outsider in my own life. I watched her as she got ready, noticing the extra care she took with her appearance. She had always been beautiful, but now she seemed to radiate a new kind of energy, one that I couldn't quite place. "Are you coming?" she asked as she grabbed her camera bag. "Yeah, I'll catch up with you," I replied, forcing a smile. She kissed me on the cheek and headed out, her excitement palpable. I took my time getting ready, not in any hurry to join her. When I finally made it to the festival grounds, I found myself wandering aimlessly, barely paying attention to the exhibits. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the past few days over and over. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her, that Claire was slipping away from me and into the orbit of another man. After an hour or so, I decided to look for Claire. I checked the schedule and saw that there was a portrait photography session that she had mentioned wanting to attend. I headed in that direction, but when I arrived, she was nowhere to be found. I searched the festival grounds, growing more anxious with each passing minute. I asked a few people if they had seen her, but no one had. Panic started to set in. Where could she be? I tried calling her, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Hours passed, and there was still no sign of Claire. I wandered the festival grounds, my heart pounding in my chest. The sun was beginning to set when I finally spotted her, emerging from a secluded area of the park with Ryan by her side. She was laughing, her face flushed with excitement. Ryan had his camera slung over his shoulder, and they were deep in conversation. They didn't see me at first, and I stood frozen, watching them from a distance. When Claire finally noticed me, her smile faltered for a split second before she quickly recovered. "Jonathan, I've been looking for you," she called out, walking over to me with Ryan trailing behind. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, we were just doing a little impromptu photo shoot," she said casually, as if disappearing for hours without a word was completely normal. "Ryan found this great spot, and we just lost track of time." I nodded, forcing a smile, but inside I was seething. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to ask her what the hell was going on. But instead, I just stood there, silent and confused, as they continued their conversation as if nothing was wrong. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, replaying every moment of the day. I knew something was wrong, something was happening that I couldn't control, but I didn't know what to do about it. The next morning, I woke up to find Claire already gone. She had left a note on the bedside table. "Gone to the morning workshop with Ryan. See you at lunch. I crumpled the note in my hand, feeling a surge of frustration. It was like she was living in a different world, one that I was no longer a part of. I spent the morning wandering the festival grounds, trying to clear my head, but everywhere I went, I saw reminders of Claire and Ryan, places where they had been together, workshops they had attended, conversations they had shared. It was suffocating. Eventually, I found myself at the hotel, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at Claire's camera bag. I hesitated for a moment, then reached for it, unzipping the main compartment and pulling out her camera. I needed to see what she had been up to understand what had drawn her so deeply into this new world. I turned on the camera and began scrolling through the photos. There were the usual festival shots, landscapes, portraits, candid moments. But as I continued to scroll, I noticed that several of the photos were missing. I knew Claire had been taking pictures throughout the festival, yet there were large gaps in the sequence. My heart started to pound as I scrolled back and forth, trying to find any trace of the missing photos. But they were gone, as if they had never existed. I couldn't help but wonder why she had deleted them. What was she hiding? I put the camera down, my hands shaking. Something was very wrong, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. Claire was slipping away from me, and I had no idea how to stop it. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening, it had started with those missing photographs, and I needed to find out the truth. Claire's newfound obsession with photography had reached a level I couldn't have imagined. After the festival, she dove headfirst into the world of lenses, lighting, and compositions. She signed up for online courses, bought expensive equipment, and even converted our spare room into a makeshift studio. I tried to support her, but it was hard. Her focus on photography felt like a barrier between us, something I couldn't penetrate. She spent hours each day studying, practicing, and shooting. I often found myself sitting alone in the living room, listening to the shutter clicks coming from the other room, wondering when this new passion would stop feeling like a threat to our marriage. Ryan was still very much a part of her life. They texted constantly, exchanged ideas, and met up frequently for photo shoots. Claire assured me it was purely professional, that Ryan was just helping her improve. But I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I tried to join them a couple of times, but it was clear that I didn't belong. Their connection was something I couldn't understand, and it only served to widen the gap between us. One Saturday morning, Claire announced she was going on a weekend photo expedition with Ryan. They were heading out of town to capture some rural landscapes. I was taken aback. She hadn't even mentioned it to me until that morning. "Why didn't you tell me about this earlier?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I didn't think it was a big deal," she replied, packing her gear. "It's just a quick trip. We'll be back tomorrow evening." I wanted to argue, to tell her that it was a big deal, that she was spending more time with Ryan than with me. But I bit my tongue, not wanting to seem controlling or paranoid. Instead, I watched her leave, feeling more isolated than ever. That evening, as I sat alone in the quiet house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her. Claire had found something that made her feel alive, something that didn't involve me. And the more time she spent with Ryan, the more I feared that this wasn't just about photography. The weekend stretched out before me like a barren landscape. Claire was gone, off in the countryside with Ryan, and I was left to navigate the silence of our home. I tried to keep myself busy, cleaning the house, catching up on work, watching TV, but nothing could distract me from the gnawing anxiety in my chest. I checked my phone constantly, hoping for a text or a call from Claire, but there was nothing. It was like she had vanished into a world that didn't include me. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Were they really just out there taking photos? Or was there something more going on, something she wasn't telling me? By Sunday afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to take a drive, to get out of the house and clear my head. But as I drove aimlessly through the city, I found myself heading toward the countryside, in the direction Claire had mentioned. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe I wanted to catch a glimpse of them, to see for myself what they were up to. Or maybe I just wanted to be closer to her, even if she didn't know it. The drive took longer than I expected, and by the time I reached the rural area Claire had mentioned, the sun was beginning to set. I drove slowly down the narrow roads, scanning the fields and hills for any sign of them. But the countryside was vast and empty, and there was no trace of Claire or Ryan. I pulled over to the side of the road and sat there for a long time, staring out at the landscape, feeling more lost than ever. As darkness fell, I finally turned the car around and headed back home. The drive back was long and lonely, and by the time I arrived, Claire was already home. She was in the living room, editing photos on her laptop, a contented smile on her face. "How was your trip?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "It was amazing," she said, not looking up from her screen. "We got some incredible shots." I nodded, forcing a smile, but inside I felt hollow. Claire was drifting further away from me, and I didn't know how to bring her back. Days turned into weeks, and Claire's obsession with photography only deepened. She spent more and more time with Ryan, going on photo shoots, attending workshops, and collaborating on projects. I watched helplessly as she slipped further into his world, leaving me behind. The tension between us grew unbearable. Every time she mentioned Ryan, I felt a surge of jealousy and anger that I struggled to contain. I wanted to trust her, to believe that their relationship was purely professional, but my instincts told me otherwise. One evening, after yet another day of Claire being out with Ryan, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and I knew the only way to get them was to confront Ryan directly. I waited until Claire was in the shower, then grabbed my phone and dialed his number. "Hey, Jonathan," Ryan answered, sounding surprised. "What's up? Can we meet?" I asked, my voice tight. "I need to talk to you about Claire." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Sure," he finally said. "When and where?" We agreed to meet at a nearby coffee shop the next afternoon. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what I would say. By the time I arrived at the coffee shop, I was a bundle of nerves. Ryan was already there, sitting at a table near the window. He greeted me with a friendly smile, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes. "What's this about, Jonathan?" he asked as I sat down. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I need to know what's going on between you and Claire," I said, cutting straight to the point. Ryan's expression shifted, a look of confusion mixed with defensiveness crossing his face. "What do you mean? We're just friends and colleagues, that's all." "I don't believe you," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "She's been spending all her time with you, going on trips, working on projects. It doesn't feel like just friendship." Ryan leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Jonathan, I'm not going to lie to you. Claire and I have developed a close bond through our work, but it's professional, nothing more. I respect her, and I respect your marriage." His words did little to ease my doubts. "If that's true, then why has she been so distant? Why does it feel like she's more connected to you than she is to me?" Ryan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I can't speak for Claire's feelings, but I can tell you that she's passionate about photography. It's something she's really good at, something she's found a new purpose in. Maybe that's something you should be supporting her in." His response stung, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. Claire had found a passion that made her happy, and instead of embracing it with her, I had let my insecurities drive a wedge between us. But even as I acknowledged that truth, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more between them, something Ryan wasn't telling me. "I just want my wife back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan looked at me with a mix of sympathy and resolve. "Then talk to her, Jonathan. Really talk to her. Don't let your fears destroy what you have." I left the coffee shop with more questions than answers. Ryan's words echoed in my mind, but they didn't ease the tension in my chest. I knew I needed to confront Claire, to have an honest conversation about what was happening, but part of me was terrified of what I might find out. After my conversation with Ryan, I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. He had urged me to talk to Claire, to really open up and address the growing distance between us. But every time I tried, the words got stuck in my throat. I was too afraid of what I might hear. Instead, I found myself obsessing over the little things. Claire's late nights editing photos, the way she laughed at Ryan's jokes, the constant text notifications on her phone. My mind was a storm of insecurity and doubt, and I didn't know how to calm it. One evening, while Claire was out at another photography workshop, I found myself scrolling through her social media accounts. I knew it was a breach of trust, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to know what was going on in her life, what she was sharing with the world, and with Ryan. At first, everything seemed normal. Claire's Instagram was filled with beautiful shots from her recent photo shoots, landscapes, portraits, still life. But as I scrolled further, I began to notice a pattern. Many of the photos were taken in places I knew she had been with Ryan. And in the comments, he was always there, leaving encouraging words and compliments that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the comments that bothered me, it was the way Claire responded to them. Her replies were warm, appreciative, even flirtatious at times. I knew I was reading too much into it, letting my jealousy cloud my judgment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on. I scrolled further, digging deeper into her posts and stories, until I came across something that made my heart stop. It was a photo Claire had posted a few days ago, a black and white portrait of herself, taken in a field at sunset. The photo was beautiful, capturing her in a way I had never seen before, but it wasn't the image that struck me. It was the caption. Finding myself in new places, with new eyes. #photography journey, #self-discovery. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Claire wasn't just talking about photography. She was talking about her life, about who she was becoming. And it was clear that this journey, this self-discovery, didn't include me. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. For the first time, I realized just how far we had drifted apart. Claire had found something that made her feel alive, something that gave her a sense of purpose and fulfillment. And I was no longer a part of that world. The truth was staring me in the face, and it was almost too much to bear. Claire had found herself, but in the process, she had lost me, and I had no idea how to bring her back. The days following my social media discovery were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. Claire and I were like two ships passing in the night, barely speaking. Our interactions reduced to polite exchanges about mundane things. The distance between us had become a chasm, and I didn't know how to bridge it. One evening, after another long day of avoiding each other, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to confront her, to finally have the conversation I had been avoiding for weeks. I needed to know the truth, even if it tore us apart. Claire was sitting at the dining table editing photos on her laptop when I walked into the room. I hesitated for a moment, gathering my courage, before finally speaking. "Claire, we need to talk." She looked up from her screen, her expression unreadable. "About what?" "About us," I said, my voice trembling. "About what's been happening between us, about Ryan." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't say anything. I took a deep breath and continued. "I feel like I'm losing you, Claire. You've been so distant, so wrapped up in photography and Ryan, and I don't know where I fit into your life anymore." She sighed, closing her laptop and folding her hands on the table. "Jonathan, I'm not trying to shut you out. Photography has just become really important to me. It's something that makes me feel alive." "I get that," I said, my voice rising in frustration. "But it feels like it's more than just photography. You've changed, Claire, and I can't help but feel like Ryan has something to do with that." Claire looked away, her jaw tightening. "Ryan is just a friend and a mentor. He's helped me discover a side of myself that I didn't even know existed. But that doesn't mean I don't care about you or about our marriage." "Then why does it feel like I'm being left behind?" I demanded, my voice cracking with emotion. "Why does it feel like you've found something better, something that doesn't include me?" Tears welled up in Claire's eyes, and for a moment I thought she might break down. But instead, she took a deep breath and met my gaze. "I'm sorry, Jonathan," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I never meant to hurt you, but the truth is, I've changed. I'm not the same person I was before, and I don't know how to go back to that. I don't want to go back." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. I had been bracing myself for this, but hearing it out loud was devastating. Claire was telling me that she was no longer the woman I had married, that she had outgrown our life together. "So what does that mean for us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Claire looked down at her hands, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't know," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I think we need to figure it out, together." The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating us both. We were standing at a crossroads, and the path forward was unclear. All I knew was that our lives would never be the same again, and I wasn't sure if our marriage could survive the journey Claire was on. After our emotional confrontation, Claire and I entered a period of uneasy silence. We both knew the conversation wasn't over, but neither of us had the energy to continue it. The days passed in a tense, uncomfortable quiet. I could feel the weight of our unresolved issues hanging over us, but neither of us seemed ready to face them head on. Claire threw herself even deeper into her photography. She was constantly on the move, attending workshops, meeting with Ryan, and working on her projects. I, on the other hand, found myself sinking into a state of resignation. I went through the motions of daily life, but it all felt meaningless. The distance between us had become a chasm I couldn't bridge. One evening, Claire announced that she was going on a week-long silent retreat. It was something she had read about online, an opportunity to disconnect from the noise of the world and reconnect with herself. I was taken aback by the suddenness of it all, but I didn't protest. "Maybe some time apart will do us both good," she said, her voice calm and detached. I nodded, unsure of what else to say. In truth, I was relieved. The silence between us had become unbearable, and the thought of spending a week apart felt like a chance to breathe. But it also terrified me. What if, during that week, Claire realized she didn't want to come back? The morning she left, I watched her drive away, feeling a mixture of sadness and dread. The house felt emptier than ever, and I was left alone with my thoughts. I spent the first few days trying to distract myself, reading, watching TV, going for long walks, but nothing could fill the void Claire had left behind. As the days went by, I started to reflect on our relationship, on where things had gone wrong. I realized that I had been so focused on my own fears and insecurities that I had lost sight of what really mattered: Claire's happiness. I had been clinging to the past, to the version of Claire that I had known, without recognizing that she had changed. And in doing so, I had pushed her away. By the end of the week, I had come to a painful realization. If I truly loved Claire, I needed to let her go. I needed to give her the space to find herself, even if that meant losing her in the process. The day Claire returned from her retreat, I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach. I had spent the entire week preparing myself for the possibility that she might come back with a decision to end our marriage. I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear it, but I knew it was inevitable. When she walked through the door, she looked different, calmer, more centered. There was a quiet strength in her that hadn't been there before, and it only confirmed my fears. She had found something during her retreat, something that didn't involve me. "Hi," she said, her voice soft as she set down her bags. "Hi," I replied, trying to read her expression. We stood there in silence for a moment, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, Claire broke the tension. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "About us, about our future." I braced myself, feeling my heart race. And I think we need to take a break," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I need time to figure out who I am, what I want, and I can't do that while we're still together." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I knew she was right. We had reached a point where we were holding each other back, clinging to a relationship that no longer worked. It was time to let go. "I understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Claire's eyes filled with tears, and she took a step closer to me. "This isn't the end, Jonathan. I still love you, but I need to do this for myself, and I hope that in time we can find our way back to each other." I nodded, unable to speak. My throat felt tight, and I fought back the tears that were threatening to fall. This was the hardest thing I had ever had to do, but I knew it was the right thing. We spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking. For the first time in months, we opened up to each other, sharing our fears, our hopes, our regrets. It was a painful conversation, but it was also healing. By the end of it, I felt a sense of closure, a sense of acceptance that I hadn't felt before. When Claire finally went to bed, I stayed up for a while, sitting in the quiet of the living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. I knew our journey wasn't over, but it was clear that we needed to walk separate paths for a while. And as much as it hurt, I was at peace with that. The days following our decision to take a break were filled with a quiet, shared sadness. Claire and I had agreed that she would move out temporarily, giving us both the space we needed to figure things out. The process of packing up her things was slow and deliberate, each item a reminder of the life we had built together and the love we had once shared. One Saturday morning, as Claire was packing her clothes, I walked into the bedroom and found her sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a photo album in her hands. It was the album from our wedding, filled with pictures of us on that joyful day when we had promised each other forever. She looked up at me, tears in her eyes. "I don't know what to do with this," she said, her voice trembling. "It feels too painful to keep, but I can't bring myself to throw it away." I sat down beside her, taking the album from her hands and flipping through the pages. The photos were a stark contrast to the reality we were facing now. Two people in love, full of hope and dreams for the future. But as I looked at those pictures, I realized that they were more than just memories. They were a reminder of the love we had shared, a love that had been real and beautiful, even if it hadn't lasted. "Let's keep it," I said softly, closing the album and setting it aside. "We don't have to look at it now, but maybe one day, when the pain isn't so fresh, we can look back and remember the good times." Claire nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. The rest of the day passed in a blur of packing and quiet conversations. We were both careful not to dwell on the sadness, instead focusing on the practicalities of the move. By the time evening came, the apartment was filled with boxes, and Claire's things were stacked neatly by the door. As we sat down for one final dinner together in our home, the reality of the situation hit me hard. This was the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in our lives. And while I knew it was the right thing to do, it didn't make it any easier. When the meal was over, we sat in silence for a long time, neither of us wanting to be the first to break the moment. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice filled with emotion. "I'm going to miss you," she said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I'm going to miss you too," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. We stayed like that for a while, holding hands across the table, taking comfort in each other's presence. And in that moment, I realized that even though we were saying goodbye, there was still love between us. Different now, but still there. When it was time for Claire to leave, I helped her carry her things to the car. We stood by the trunk for a long time, neither of us wanting to be the first to say goodbye. Finally, Claire leaned in and hugged me tightly, her tears soaking into my shirt. "I'll always love you, Jonathan," she whispered. "I'll always love you too," I replied, my voice choked with emotion. And with that, she got into the car and drove away, leaving me standing alone in the driveway. I watched until her taillights disappeared into the distance, and then I turned and walked back into the empty house, feeling the weight of the loss settle in. The weeks that followed Claire's departure were some of the loneliest of my life. The house, once filled with the sounds of our lives together, was now eerily quiet. I found myself going through the motions, trying to fill the emptiness with work, hobbies, and time with friends. But no matter what I did, there was always a void that nothing seemed to fill. Despite the loneliness, there was also a strange sense of relief. Without the constant tension and unresolved issues hanging over us, I felt like I could finally breathe. I started to take a hard look at myself, at the person I had become over the years. I realized that I had been so focused on my fears and insecurities that I had lost sight of who I was, what I wanted. One weekend, I decided to take a trip to the countryside, the same area where Claire and Ryan had gone for their photo shoots. I needed to get away from the city, from the memories, and find some peace. As I drove through the winding roads, surrounded by the beauty of nature, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I spent the days hiking, exploring, and reflecting on everything that had happened. I thought about Claire, about our relationship, and about the ways we had both changed. And for the first time, I felt a sense of acceptance. I realized that our love had been real, but it had also been flawed. We had both made mistakes, and we had both grown in different directions. On the final day of my trip, I came across a small secluded spot by a lake. It was quiet, peaceful, and the perfect place to sit and reflect. As I sat by the water, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't felt before. I realized that it was time to let go of the past, to accept that our relationship was over, and to start looking toward the future. When I returned home, I felt lighter, more at peace with myself. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I also knew that I was ready to face it. I had rediscovered a sense of purpose, a sense of who I was outside of my relationship with Claire, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. Months passed, and life slowly began to take on a new rhythm. Claire and I stayed in touch, occasionally meeting for coffee or exchanging messages. Our conversations were friendly, but there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. It was clear that we were both moving on, each of us finding our own way in the world. One day, as I was walking through the city, I passed by a photography exhibit at a small gallery. The sign outside caught my eye: New Perspectives, a Journey of Self-Discovery. Intrigued, I decided to go inside. As I walked through the gallery, I was struck by the beauty and emotion captured in the photographs. Each image told a story, a journey of finding oneself in the midst of life's challenges. And as I reached the final room, I was surprised to see a familiar name on the wall: Claire Reynolds. Her photographs were stunning, filled with a depth and vulnerability that I hadn't seen before. They were a testament to the journey she had been on, the self-discovery that had taken her away from me. But as I looked at each image, I felt a sense of pride and happiness for her. She had found her path, and she was thriving. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a voice behind me. "Jonathan?" I turned to see Claire standing there, a mixture of surprise and warmth in her eyes. "Claire," I said, smiling, "these are amazing. You've really found your calling." "Thank you," she said, her smile softening. "It's been a journey, but I finally feel like I'm where I'm meant to be." We stood there in silence for a moment, both of us taking in the significance of the moment. It was a bittersweet reminder of what we had lost, but also a recognition of what we had gained. "Are you happy?" I asked, genuinely wanting to know. "I am," she replied, her eyes filled with sincerity, "and I hope you are too." "I'm getting there," I said, nodding. "I think we both needed this time to find ourselves." Claire smiled, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace between us. We had both been on a journey, one that had taken us in different directions, but it had also brought us to a place of understanding and acceptance. As we said our goodbyes, I walked out of the gallery with a sense of closure. Our story wasn't one of a fairy tale ending, but it was real, and it was ours. We had both grown, both changed, and while we hadn't ended up together, we had found our own paths. And as I walked down the street, I felt a sense of hope for the future. A future where I could embrace new beginnings, new possibilities, and most importantly, a new understanding of myself.